Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Helping Nonprofits Navigate the RFP Process. My name is Annie Deere, and I am joined here with Nick Centineo, Senior Investment Consultant at Manning & Napier. Nick has been with the firm since 2006, and his primary responsibilities include providing analytical support to institutional clients in the areas of objective setting, cash flow analysis, and asset allocation. Nick is also a member of our endowment and foundation service team and is a frequent contributor to our firm's communication and thought leadership in the nonprofit space. We know that the RFP process can seem intimidating for nonprofit professionals and board members that already have so much to do and not enough time and resources to do it. But it is so important to evaluate your advisor and make sure that they are and continue to be the best fit for your organization. So our goal today is to be a resource for you and to share some best practices to help make this process just a little bit easier. In today's presentation, we will discuss how to reevaluate your investment advisor, ways to characterize your search, steps to take when crafting your RFP, and considerations to take when choosing your investment advisor. So let's get started by taking a look at some of the ways to reevaluate your investment advisor. Nick, what are some important questions that organizations should ask?
Thanks, Annie. To me, the most straightforward point of evaluation are your results. Of course, are you meeting your goals? And for most nonprofit portfolios, goals are framed in the context of one of three things: growing assets, meeting withdrawals, and maintaining purchasing power in light of inflation. The standard endowment model has a bit of each of these, right? So if you have an 8% return target, that allows you to maintain real purchasing power of your assets if your annual spending is about 5% and inflation is about 3%. And so you can prioritize these goals to different degrees, depending on your particulars. But for most organizations, these are the common goals that you're really assessing. Now, one good way to measure results are with net of fees investment performance. That's the percent return of your portfolio after paying the fees. After paying the fees that you need to manage it. Now, you can look at a number. You can look at this number on both an absolute basis and on a relative basis versus a benchmark index, for example. But what I've found is that there's often a misconception out there that you should be trying to minimize fees, but that's not really necessarily the best measure, in our opinion. Your fees should really be appropriate for the value that you're receiving when you're paying them. Net of fee performance automatically measures a lot of that value after the fees have been paid. And so that's why we think it's the best number to evaluate your success with. It's not the end all be all, but it's probably the most important single number that you can assess. One more sort of insider view on performance. The market itself has a lot to say about whether you're successful or not. A 60-40 stock bond portfolio has averaged about 8% returns over the long term since 1926. But there have been long blocks of time when returns have deviated meaningfully from that average. So for example, over any 10-year rolling time period since 1926, the best annual return for that same 60-40 portfolio has been about 17% per year. The worst annualized return over any 10-year time period has been about 1% per year. So there's a huge range of outcomes around that long-term average. And when you're evaluating an advisor, the environment that they've operated in, whether it's good or bad, it should really be a part of that evaluation, an important part of that evaluation. And if, just for an example, if an advisor has been able to hit your return target, even amidst maybe a less than favorable environment, that's great. That can be counted as a plus for them. But similarly, if they've never really been tested in a bad market, you have to factor that in too. And so when we do an assessment, we really strive to do it over as balanced of a time period as possible, ideally a length of time that includes both good and bad market environments. Now, beyond just pure investment results, there's the level of engagement and the service that you're getting. For most organizations, the more engagement, the better. But essentially, ask yourself, is your advisor meeting your expectations? And do they have a deep bench of support beyond perhaps just a single person? And then what services do they provide to complement the investments? Do they help with planning, with your policies, with educating your board and staff, or do they help maybe with fundraising efforts? These are all important things for an advisor to do, I think, and certainly important questions to ask.
Now that we have the important questions to ask, what are some of the criteria that organizations can use to define their search?
Yeah, so let's suppose you want to do a new search. Maybe you're unhappy with your current advisor, or you just want to look at the range of different options that are out there. Establishing your priorities and requirements first is a best practice, I think, because it can help you avoid bias later on. So it's smart to create a rubric or a scoring system for all the different points of comparison that are important to you. And so that's the first thing that I'd recommend doing, and establishing that baseline of comparison. Then it's important to figure out who's going to do the work. In our experience, it's common to appoint the investment committee to lead the search, or maybe if you don't have an investment committee, perhaps designate a special search committee for just this purpose. Expect there to be a good deal of work involved. A search does involve developing materials, sending them out, and coordinating all the responses. And so you definitely want people who are going to be engaged and active in this process. Investment advisors, accountants, attorneys, financial managers, and development directors are all good examples of the types of job titles that are really going to have the expertise you need on your committee. And then a common question that a lot of people have: how do you find qualified candidates to invite to respond? A good committee can help here too. If people are well connected in your community, you can ask them for suggestions, ask the committee members for their suggestions. You can know which advisors have a reputation of working specifically with nonprofits. Many that do have that reputation like to promote themselves in your space. They attend events, they encourage volunteering among their employees, et cetera. And so they should be very visible. And you can benefit from keeping a running list of advisors who might be a good fit. And then I think at this stage, and maybe as the last thing to prepare, it's also really important to establish a timeline. Before you send out any questions, before you let any advisors know about this RFP, mark a calendar for when you want to hit the big milestones. The big ones probably being issuing the RFP, receiving answers back, picking finalists, and then doing a finals presentation. Doing that at the front end can really help keep the whole process moving. And while this whole process while it can be done fairly quickly if needed, I think you do get a better quality product by not rushing things. So know going in, it could take several months to run a search from start to finish.
Great. So now that we have a basis of how to identify which investment managers to put an RFP out to, let's talk about what goes into the actual RFP. Nick, what are some important questions that organizations should include here?
Yeah, so we have our list of topic areas here. Now, everything is fair game in an RFP. You can really ask whatever you want, whatever you feel will be important for making a decision. And normally, I'd say the more information, the better. However, after working on RFPs for a number of years, both helping to issue them and helping to answer them, I've really come around to the point of view that brevity is more and more is appreciated, just to make the process easier and to sort of force your respondents to be more concise. And so I guess the bottom line is, we suggest asking questions that'll be relevant, of course, and that can be answered concisely, and to be specific for what you're asking for, because very broad, open-ended questions might just end up wasting your time, honestly. So crucial items are going to be an advisor's history and background, That should include any regulatory matters. Sort of an insider's viewpoint on this area. If this is for an endowment, ask about UPMIFA. If they know what it is, and how they ensure compliance with it. That's going to be a good test to indicate their experience specifically with nonprofits. You'll want a number of questions on client service, including team bios and what they can commit to in terms of meetings and reports. You'll want to ask about their actual investment process and philosophy. It's certainly important to get a good idea for how the process has changed over time. And so it's definitely fair game to ask about historical details too. Performance characteristics is another important one, of course. Make sure you get net of fees. You can ask for trailing returns, 1, 3, 5, 10 years, etc. I find it very helpful to also ask for calendar year returns, really as far back as they can provide them. That gives a lot more granularity to explain performance. And that lets you key in on certain important milestone years. Like 2020 is a good example. You can look to see how an advisor navigated the COVID shock and how they performed in 2020 specifically. Another special topic while we're on performance, the Global Investment Performance Standards, also known as GIPS. These are institutional standards for how performance is calculated. And it includes best practices like using actual client returns and grouping clients with like objectives together. It's basically best practices when it comes to presenting performance to prospects like you. And so it's a good idea to ask whether an advisor complies with GIPS in an RFP too. And then fees and resources as the last area. You're going to want to ask to see their fee schedule, ask if discounts are available to that schedule, and you'll want to ask about other value-added services and whether those are included in that fee or not. Again, helping with planning, helping with projections, writing policies, doing education, and fundraising. These are all services that advisors can provide, and so it's certainly worth asking about.
That brevity is appreciated in RFPs, but it's also important to provide enough background on your organization. So what are some of the best ways to provide sufficient information about the organization to potential investment advisors?
Yeah, it's funny. So anyone who's issued an RFP has probably experienced getting a response that's just way off base. Maybe it's not what you're looking for, or maybe it just isn't clear how it'll solve your pain points. And so there's ways you can help yourself avoid that. And giving the right information to respondents at the outset goes a long way towards that. So we have some ideas on this slide. First, attach an investment policy statement or an IPS. It should include your objectives, your time horizon, withdrawal needs, your risk tolerance, and your guidelines and restrictions. If this is a new pool of money, maybe you don't have an IPS yet, or maybe you'd like to work with an advisor to help you write one or help you adjust one, and all of that's okay. Nothing needs to be set in stone at the onset, but at least having a preliminary idea for these different items, what these different things should be, that should help advisors better respond. And so having perhaps a preliminary meeting, to outline what you might like to see in a policy is a good first step to take before the RFP. You'll want to lay out the structure of the assets that are going to be managed. What are these assets? What's their purpose? Are they endowed, restricted use in some way? Are they board designated? Do you have a spending policy in place? These are all good questions that advisors would like to know. You'll want to outline where these assets came from, or maybe will come from. It's good background to know if you're currently still raising assets, maybe via a campaign or planned gifts, and if you have a target goal for how large you want your portfolio to grow to. And then lastly, have a formal process for how to ask a question. You have to be a little careful with questions. Public entities especially do have ethics rules to avoid bias and favoritism. Best practice that I've seen is to have a question submission period. Maybe it lasts for a few weeks after the RFP is sent. You can mandate that all questions be emailed to a designated committee member, and that person would compile answers to all the questions at the same time and then send them out to all the RFP respondents after the question window is ended. And so to me, that's a pretty fair way of handling questions, because I think it doesn't put any one respondent at a disadvantage. And so that's what we suggest for handling questions.
So once you've crafted the RFP and received responses back from potential investment advisors, you can invite the candidates to give a finals presentation. So what are some important things to consider during this part of the process?
Yeah, a finals presentation is a great way to interact with your advisor candidates in person, or at least in person virtually. I suppose that's decision number one. What is your preferred way to interact with an advisor? A finals presentation lets you test that interaction, basically. And I mean, a word like chemistry is a strong word, but I think it's apt here. Most committees want someone who's a great communicator, who can demonstrate the breadth of resources they have at their disposal. And most want to see someone who is passionate about what they do and passionate about helping your organization. And so a finals presentation is a great way to test all these different aspects. So other steps for a successful finals presentation includes, it's common to invite a short list of candidates to be interviewed, maybe 3 or 4 as sort of a target, 3 or 4 of maybe the top scoring respondents from your RFP answers. You'll want to define the format of the presentation, including the length of time that you allow them to present for. Usually an hour or more is necessary for each candidate. You can, again, say up front that brevity is appreciated, but these presentations do have a way of always taking longer than you think, and allowing it to flow naturally and leaving enough room for questions and answers is important, I think, also. So certainly take that into account. You'll want to identify who will be the key individuals from your team to attend, of course, and then you'll want to have questions. It's okay to share questions ahead of the presentation. It's also okay to think of them spontaneously, but this, I would really underscore here, this is your best chance to hear how an advisor explains their process, and their answers can be very telling, both in the substance of their answers and in the style too. So this is just a great opportunity to gain that insight with a finals presentation in person.
And after the finals presentation wraps up, you get to the tail end of the selection process. How does flexibility play a role here?
There are many options for choosing an advisor, and that's great. There are active and passive styles. There are proprietary managers versus managers building a fund of funds approach. And there are flexible allocators versus ones that have specific allocation targets. All these options are okay, so long as the investment case is plausible to you and that you feel that you're receiving value for the fee you pay. Now, everyone can have personal opinions on these different options, and advisor selection is certainly not a science by any stretch. There's no universal decision engine, really. So committee members are, when it comes down to it, they are left making a judgment call. But what's really important from a fiduciary perspective is to have an unbiased process and be prudent in your selection for how you make that call, how you make that decision, how you make that decision. Prudence, in this case, is legally defined by courts. And a fiduciary must act as a prudent person would, taking into account the particular needs of your organization and acting as if it were your own money. And so flexibility comes into play because you don't have to be committed to any particular philosophy or style, but you do need to use a prudent process and make a plausible decision. That's going to be in your organization's best interest over the long term.
Another important consideration we have is how an investment committee actually arrives at a consensus when making the choice. So, what are some criteria that an investment committee can use to come to an agreement?
Yeah, so every evaluation that I've been a part of looks at some combination of people, process, and performance. You obviously want advisors who check all the boxes and are well-rounded. The problem is there tends to be an overemphasis on the past when assessing each of these aspects. And the past is not necessarily a good or perfect guide to the future outcomes. So a couple examples. You can have a great investment process, for example, but what about it makes you think that its success can continue in the future? Is it dynamic enough to maybe change along with what works in different markets? By the same token, you can have great historical performance results, but we know that no two market environments are exactly the same. And so how do you expect this strategy to perform in the future? If you have this type of mindset, this future-looking mindset, there are some indicators you can look at to help give you insight. For example, so let's go through each of these criteria one by one. So if you're assessing an advisor's people criteria, is there a succession process in place, or is there a team that can keep the process going in the event that someone leaves? That might be a good indicator for whether future success is likely, as has past success. Under the process category, is there a reason why you think an investment process can continue to be successful in the future? Have there been any prior changes to how their process has been handled? If there have been process changes, has it happened where their track record can't be relied upon to represent the reality of how a portfolio is managed today? Is the process flexible enough to be successful over different markets? Or maybe is it more narrowly tailored to only one specific type of environment? And then for performance, ask yourself, has it been demonstrated that this advisor has performed well in a variety of market environments? Or maybe is all their value add just concentrated in a very narrow type of environment? Would you be okay with maybe going through a length of time when your portfolio trails a benchmark, if the trade-off is that over the long term you can outperform? So these are all hypothetical questions. They're future-looking questions, but they are all important questions, I think, to ask. And so hopefully that's gotten your brain thinking about really assessing these areas, each of these areas dynamically. Asking what if and why is usually my motto, because we know that the future is uncertain, and you're best served by finding advisors who can help you navigate that uncertainty. And having that mindset when you're selecting an advisor is important, we think.
As we've mentioned before, the RFP process can be daunting for nonprofits. So what are some of the common mistakes that organizations could make that might hinder the selection process?
I think that not providing enough information to respondents or allowing them to ask questions. We talked about this before. You want this process to be efficient, so you should be open about what you're looking for. You should spend the time before the RFP to think about what requirements you have. And you should really think hard about your investment policy, which is the most important document when it comes to your portfolio. I think failing to evaluate the total value, I've seen it many times, decisions that might be just based on fees alone. That doesn't account for the value that you get for the fee you pay overall. And that value can be gotten from higher performance. It can be gotten from better service, better reporting, more planning resources. And so there are lots of points to evaluate besides just fees. Remember that. And then don't forget to provide feedback to respondents either. I know advisors appreciate this. They want to know why they were or weren't chosen and what they can do to improve. And everyone appreciates constructive feedback. And it's certainly helpful to maintain relationships too. So providing that transparency into your process and feedback on the results is really a good first step toward achieving that.
Nick, thank you so much for sharing all of this valuable insight with us. We hope the information that we shared today helps make the RFP process just a little less daunting for you and your organization. And as a reminder, we are here to help with more than just navigating the RFP process. Our endowment and foundation team can help your organization with portfolio evaluations, investment policy statements, and board and staff education, just to name a few. And we also publish monthly blog posts, host quarterly webinars, and provide other thought leaderships on our Insights for Nonprofits site. So if you are not already subscribed, feel free to sign up to receive these complimentary resources using the link we provided right here on this slide. If you have any questions about anything we discussed today, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we will get back to you within a few business days. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.